do you want? What do you think? What do you want? I want the latest games anywhere. What do you want? I want the sounds that curl my hair. Ow!
Video games are the latest craze to sweep the country and most of the world, too. Millions of people are addicted to hours of gazing at electronic images on game screens in arcades and in their own homes. What makes video games so popular? Well, we search for an answer as we begin a special series on Video Fever, games people play.
In 1981, Americans popped in between $5 and $9 billion worth of quarters and tokens into the slots of arcade video games. There is so much money to be made that the manufacturers can ill afford to ignore trends in the marketplace.
The familiar din of the video arcade is fading out. Business has dropped in half over the past year, and companies like Atari claim losses of more than $350 million. The slick, swift-paced space games are taking a nosedive, and analysts predict a crunch in the industry by Christmas. The craze has definitely peaked.
The video game industry was dead to begin with, dead as a doornail. Due to a slew of poor video game titles released in the home market, as well as other factors, there was a huge crisis of consumer confidence in video games in the beginning of 1983. Seemingly overnight, the demand for video games dropped to virtually zero, causing many game companies' stock price to fall. With so many companies flooding the game market at once, many companies immediately folded. Retailers, unable to return product to companies that went bankrupt, had little choice but to heavily discount items to get them off store shelves. This made a bad situation worse by flooding the market with cheap, but very poorly made video games. Many who bought these games, even at discounted rates, felt very cheated, and by the end of 1983, the public opinion was that video games were just a fad and the craze was over. Companies that would not survive the video game crash include Coleco, Mattel, GCE, and yes, even Atari. As their stock prices kept plummeting, Warner Communications decided to sell off Atari, splitting it into two different companies. From 1983 until the fall of 1985, there would be no new home video game consoles released with any measure of success. However, video games did live on during this time period thanks to another revolution that was taking place in the early 1980s. Despite what many video game industry analysts were thinking at the time, video games did not die, however they were transported into home computers. Many families in the 1980s started adopting computers, primarily as a tool to help with things like word processing and household finances, but another major selling point was, unlike video game consoles, these machines were seen as educational. As many parents started buying home computers for their kids, video game developers saw an opportunity to provide games on a platform that the kids already had. Computer games would become the next big business in video games. However, this is only the story in North America. In other parts of the world, the video game crash really didn't occur. For example, in Japan, the video game industry was just taking off. Companies like Nintendo and Sega were having a lot of success selling their home video game consoles in the Japanese market. Nintendo ended up being the first company to push the idea of selling home consoles in North America. They had been trying to find a partner to distribute their Famicom in the United States, and they were even in talks with Atari at the time of the video game crash, but due to Atari's collapse and eventual sale, this deal never went through, prompting Nintendo to take matters into their own hands. Nintendo set up a headquarters in North America and showcased their new idea called the Nintendo Advanced Video System at the Summer CES show in 1984. But Nintendo failed to gain any sort of interest in the console. The problem was that many people still believed that video game consoles were a fad that had come and gone, and that there would be no profits made in trying to revive that industry. Nintendo, not really willing to give up on the market, spent the next year redesigning their console, disguising it as a toy rather than a game console. In the fall of 1985, Nintendo launched their Nintendo Entertainment System. And although the console was not a blockbuster hit, its initial sales were strong enough to turn the heads of many people who thought the game industry was dead. The following year, Sega would release their Master System, and Atari would bring their latest console back from the dead to compete in the newly revitalized video game market. It is here where the 8-bit war officially begins. Hello everyone, welcome to a very special episode of Player One Start. Today we're going to talk about the Atari 7800, the Sega Master System, and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and we're going to have them face off to see which one was better. Before we get too far into it, if this is your first time here, there were actually 3 videos that preceded this one, and I'm going to leave links to those down in the description. If you want to watch those before or after this video, the choice is up to you. Also, if you haven't clicked that like and subscribe button yet, please remember to do so before the end of this video. But oh my gosh, what a dramatic opening to set the stage for the 8-bit war. Atari was the dominating force here in North America, from the introduction of the video computer system in 1977 to the crash of the video game market in 1983. Once the market had crashed, it was the opinion of almost everyone at the time that video games were a fad that had come and gone. And it was during this time that a lot of the top video game developers of the time actually folded and went under. The ones that survived, though, had done so by moving on to home computers. Companies like Activision and Electronic Arts decided that they would move into a platform that people most likely had in their homes, and that would have been a system like the Commodore 64 or the Apple II, and even including the IBM PC market. You know, computers at this time were still actually reserved mostly to computer hobbyists, tech geeks, and the like. Some families actually started purchasing computers because they were seen as something that was educational for their kids. And keep in mind that most of these machines would actually remain offline or not connected to the internet. The modern web was actually still years away. And this leads me to a question that I am often asked of younger people, and that is, what did you do with computers back in the day before the internet? Well, the answer is, we play computer games. From 1984 until 1985, most of the games that came out would actually do so on home computers, and anyone attempting to bring a new video game console to market was met with large criticism. However, that didn't stop Nintendo. It actually took a couple of years for Nintendo to convince people that it was worthy to invest in video games. They went to extreme lengths with retailers to even stock their system at first. And even though they weren't an initial blockbuster success, the fact that Nintendo wasn't necessarily a clear and utter failure turned the heads of other video game companies and changed the minds of many people that video games were just a fad. It turns out people will still play video games if they're good. So since I've already covered each of these consoles in their own video, I'm going to go ahead and just have each video game company showcase their own with the ads they released. So let's go ahead and take a look.
What will the future bring from Nintendo? More hits like The Legend of Zelda. Sports hits like ice hockey. Nintendo has the most video game hits like Hogan's Alley and Donkey Kong Classics, and more like Excite Bike and RC Pro-Am. And you can play them only on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers. And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
In 1986, we also introduced the next generation of video game systems, the new 7800, and it was an immediate smash hit. Early in 87, new super game titles like one-on-one basketball, Winter Games, and Skyfox will be released to take advantage of the 7800's great graphics, lifelike animation, and superb sound effects. Plus, there will be other hot new titles from such top software companies as Activision, Electronic Arts, Rotorbund, and Epix. And at under $100, the 7800 is one of the best home entertainment values in the world. That's why we're telling millions of consumers that Atari has reinvented the video game.
So there we have it, the Nintendo, the Sega, and the Atari. But actually, there is a fourth contender if you really consider it. Remember how we talked about Atari being pulled in different directions, even being split in half? Well, Atari actually released another game console, believe it or not, that was intended to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's actually based on their Atari 8-bit computer line, and it's called the Atari XE Game System. Let's go ahead and take a quick look.
This is the Nintendo Video Game System. It plays only cartridge games. This is the new Atari XE System. It plays cartridge and disc-based games. Disc drive sold separately, and only Atari comes with a real joystick. Both have guns, but only Atari comes with the target game Bug Hunt. Nintendo has a toy robot, but only Atari gives you a keyboard for playing advanced computer games. It even comes with the amazing Flight Simulator 2 cartridge. The new Atari XE Video Game System. Unbeatable.
So the main advantage of the Atari XE game system was that it could play all of the old Atari 8-bit computer games that came out before it, even those on disc, not just on cartridge. This was also during the time that they had re-released the Atari 2600 as the Junior. So that means that Atari was actually supporting 3 different consoles at the same time by 1987. However, I have left the XE game system out of the 8-bit, or at least for now, because it actually has more to do with their Atari computer line, and I'll talk about that in a future video. But alright, we've set the stage, now let's start comparing the consoles. It's hard to know even where to begin when comparing such classic consoles from the 1980s. It could be best to start where it all started for me. This is my original Nintendo Entertainment System that I got in 1988. This console has a box look and sharp corners that only the 1980s could provide. On the front we have Nintendo Entertainment System printed in red, right above the power and reset buttons. All of that is opposite of the 2 controller ports on the side. Turning around to the side of the console, you can see the hookups for red audio and yellow composite video. On the back, you can see the RF out port, as well as the channel selector, which I always set to channel 3. Both of those reside next to the barrel jack power port for the AC adapter. This console's cool and unique tray cartridge loading system is also its biggest design flaw. However, this is not the only Nintendo Entertainment System that Nintendo put out. Here is the NES2, also known as the top loader. The console is noticeably slimmer and removed the defective tray mechanism. Power and reset are now loaded on top of the console, but still right next to the controller ports. Flipping the console around to the back, gone are the composite audio and video hookups, and instead we're left with only the RF out. Overall, this console's low-profile design gives it a nice sleek look and is a welcome improvement to the original system. Next we move on to the Sega Master System. This console has a sleek black look, and instead of a boxy shape, it actually looks more like a pyramid with its sharp angled top. On the front of the console is the power button, followed by 2 controller ports, and an alternate cartridge slot known as the Sega card port. Underneath the cartridge port, highlighted in red, are what appear to be instructions on how to operate the console. This gives the console more of a futuristic look. On the back of the console, you will see an RF out next to an AC power adapter jack. Again, my RF out is set to channel 3. However, you can also get AV out via a DIN connector that was standard on a lot of computers of the 1980s. Sega was the first of the major video game companies of the 1980s to release a revised console. This was dubbed the Master System 2. Released in 1990, the sharp angled edges are now smoothed out to give it more of a rounded appearance. The cartridge port also, instead of having a double flip gate that pushes down when you put in a cartridge, it actually has a gate that you have to manually open to insert a cartridge. This version of the console also removed the card port, which was not widely used, to reduce cost. And like the NES top loader, it removed the AV composite out, leaving only an RF jack on the back. Both of these consoles have telltale signs of the era they were designed in, the original 1985 console having the sharp edges, and the Master System 2 having rounded corners of the 90s. Next, we have the Atari 7800 Pro system. It may be interesting to note that this was the first console actually to have a commercial release, so its design predates both the Nintendo and the Sega Master System. The fact that this console was initially designed to compete with the ColecoVision appears to be evident in its design, as it has an embossed metal strip that is seated just below the cartridge port, as well as a rainbow-colored strip that was also evident on the ColecoVision in its logo. This console, however, has a mixture of both worlds of having sharp edges on the sides and a rounded base in the front. And that is where the power and pause button resides. There is an LED power indicator to tell when the console is turned on. On the other side is your select and reset button. Turning the console onto the back, you will see the proprietary power adapter connection, and you will not find an RF connection on my console. However, that is the only way this console was initially made. My console has been modded to have a composite video and analog audio out. So when evaluating this console design, I will go ahead and leave that out. I do enjoy this console's design, especially compared with the Atari 2600, however it does appear dated when sitting next to the other two consoles, as it reminds me more of a ColecoVision and early 80s era rather than the later 1980s. As with previous reviews when I compare consoles, I reached out to the Twitter community to see which console you all felt looked better, and here are the results of that poll. But does this sway my decision, and which console do I think looks better by design? This was a tough decision, but ultimately I believe that the Sega Master System is designed the best. I do prefer the black plastic case of the Master System as compared to the white and gray box of the Nintendo, and I like how the cartridge port stands out at the top of a pyramid as opposed to the Atari 7800. I will state this opinion is mostly subjective, and I know that other people will have different opinions than me, but for the purposes of this review, the Sega Master System wins in this category.
Alright, so at this point I'm actually only going on console aesthetics, basically how things look. And I realize that this is a very subjective opinion. Everyone that you talk to is going to have a different opinion about which console looks better and why they feel that way. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at a piece of hardware that provides a bit more functionality.
When evaluating controller design, there are actually two facets you have to look at. First, there's the appearance, and next is how the controller feels and handles. Taking a look at the controller for the Nintendo Entertainment System, you can see how its color scheme matches the original console. The controller also shares the same boxy shape of the console. The controller is laid out in a logical design that almost every game console since has mimicked. You have the directional pad or D-pad located on the left of the controller, with a start and select button in the middle, and your action buttons located on the right. As with the redesign of this console, the Nintendo Entertainment System controller also got a brand new design. Again, the color scheme was altered to match the color scheme of the console, as the gray and black are now gone. The controller also loses its boxy shape and has more rounded corners. In fact, as both sides of the controller are rounded, it has earned the nickname the dog bone controller, based on this shape. The directional pad remains largely unchanged, however the start and select buttons now have an angle, and the A and B button also have a slight angle similar to the Super Nintendo controller. With this new design, the controller also feels much more comfortable in your hands than the boxy controller of the original console. However, from my experience, playing with this controller does take away from a little bit of the nostalgia of playing with the older box controller. The controller of the Sega Master System also shares its aesthetic with the original Sega Master System console. Although it does have that box shape, the angles are actually not as sharply cut and are a bit more rounded than the Nintendo controller, and thus feels a bit more comfortable in your hand, although this controller is a bit smaller. That's partially due to the fact that there are 2 less buttons on this controller. The Master System, being released after the Nintendo, did copy the directional pad, but took a different approach to avoid infringing on or paying license to Nintendo's patent on the directional pad. It does make it a bit more difficult to tell which direction you're pointing your directional pad without actually looking at it. However, the ridges for up, down, left, and right, and even the diagonal directions help out a lot. The action buttons are simply labeled 1 and 2, with one of those buttons also duplicating as your start button. The pause button is actually located directly on the console on both versions. Unlike the Nintendo redesign, Sega did not redesign their controller when releasing the Master System 2. And lastly, we'll take a look at the Atari 7800 controller. Again, this controller looks a little bit dated, actually looking like it would compete with something like the ColecoVision or a console that was released before the Nintendo Entertainment System. I will say, out of all the controllers that I've used for an Atari console, this one actually feels the most comfortable in my hand. However, it does require both of my hands to operate, one for holding the controller and operating the action buttons, and another for actually controlling the joystick. When this controller was shipped overseas, it actually came with a different controller, more stylized after the Nintendo Entertainment System controller. Since those are rare and hard to find here in the US, I actually ended up getting this custom controller that is identical to the Nintendo Entertainment System controller, and this became my preferred way to play Atari 7800 games. You could also use a Sega Genesis controller on this console. However, I have heard that you can accidentally fry out your console by pressing the start button, as it links to a pin that is usually used for regulating power on the 7800. For most games, I did enjoy using this controller better. However, there are some games where you might prefer a joystick rather than a directional pad. That choice is up to you. So out of all these controllers, which one did I find the best? Again, here are the results of my Twitter poll asking this question. Well, I have to go with the Nintendo Entertainment System controller on this one. And if I were to narrow it down even further, I would choose the Dogbone controller for the NES too. I give this to Nintendo for creating the directional pad, which made gaming accessible to a large audience. And on every controller, even to this day, there is still a directional pad on the left and action buttons on the right, along with a start button somewhere in the middle.
Alright, so in my opinion, controller design can make or break a console, as I've stated in my previous videos. However, my main reasoning for awarding this to Nintendo is the fact that they were the first to invent the directional pad. Although it wasn't originally designed for the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was actually designed for one of their Game & Watch games. Their controller layout would set the standard for what a controller should look like up until the present day. So because of its iconic status and effect on every video game console since, not just including Nintendo's own brand, I have to award this to Nintendo. Next, let's go ahead and open up these consoles and see what they're made of.
It's important to note that there are two different processor types that were used in the mid-1980s on gaming consoles. The Nintendo Entertainment System used a custom chip that was based around the 6502, which ran at about 1.79 MHz. The Sega Master System, however, used a Zilog Z80 based processor, and that ran at about 4 MHz. The Atari 7800 again used a 6502 compatible CPU that ran at 1.79 MHz. However, this was able to be scaled back to 1.17 MHz to enable 2600 backwards compatibility. Now, you may automatically assume that the Sega Master System's processor was better. However, due to the differences in processor architecture, it may take more cycles to accomplish the same tasks that the 6502 could. And although a processor is essential to make a console function, it may not be the determining factor in which of these consoles perform better. When it came to gaming systems of the 1980s, most gamers were mainly concerned about which console could provide graphics that were closest to the arcades. This was an early focus of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Its custom graphics chip, titled the Picture Processing Unit, was capable of displaying a 256x240 playfield, along with being able to produce 64 sprites per screen, a maximum of 8 per horizontal scanline. The chip was capable of producing 48 colors in total, although there were several limitations on which colors can be used at once. Sega's graphics chip, dubbed the Video Display Processor, had a slightly smaller playfield, however it was capable of producing the same 64 sprites with 8 per line as the Nintendo. The difference here is its expanded color palette of 64 colors, being able to show 32 of them simultaneously on screen at once. The 7800 used a custom graphics chip called the Maria chip, although it also had the TIA chip in the console as well to provide backwards compatibility for 2600 titles. Overall, it has the smallest maximum resolution, however it has the most amount of sprites, having 100 per screen and 30 per line. Technically speaking, the 7800 has the most colors, however all the colors are generated from just 16 basic colors, and they are able to use different hues or different brightness settings to change the colors into different shades. Years later, these tech demos show off what the maximum capabilities were on these older consoles. Clever programmers have found a way to push these consoles to their theoretical limit. They combine some of the old programming tricks that coders used to use back in the day, and combine them with new and most often undocumented ways of pushing these consoles past what they were supposed to do. Though no games exist from the console's lifetime that would use these tricks, these feats are still very impressive. It can be hard to judge a console's graphics chip just solely based on the games that used it, because it was actually up to each game developer to be able to program the chip to have its maximum potential be shown on screen. So when judging each game console's graphics chip, I'll try to actually include both the technical specs and the way it was used. So, which game console has the best graphics? Before I give you my judgment, here's how you all voted on Twitter. Well, from my perspective, the clear winner here is the Sega Master System. With almost every game that I put into this system, I was impressed with the graphical prowess of this console. That expanded color palette of this system allows it to have just that much more detail on each character and background that just seems to be missing on the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Atari 7800. I was tempted to go with the 7800 for best graphics, but even though they were allowed to have more hardware sprites on screen, and possibly more colors, I noticed that the character models and backgrounds had less detail on this console consistently over every game I tried. The Nintendo Entertainment System has a lot of iconic and amazing artwork that came out of that system, but I feel a lot of that was despite the console's limitations, rather than because of the console's strengths. I gotta tell you, Sega's graphics instantly hooked me into each game that I played. You know, I've long said that better graphics doesn't necessarily make a better game, but in this case, it was something that made a good game better. It was just something that I kept noticing, like, wow, this looks like a Nintendo game, but it looks so much better. Having that expanded color palette so that they could add just that much more detail to everything just made everything, in my opinion, look a little bit better. And it was something that, you know, after years of playing the Nintendo Entertainment System, I've seen a lot of graphics on that system. Some of them are great, some of them are not so great, but overall, you can tell that they were limited by what the graphics chip could do on that console. I didn't get that sense as much from the Sega Master System. And to tell you the truth, I was actually rooting for the Atari 7800, especially due to that sprite count, but the lack of detail and everything and the blandness of it just really left me with some crushing disappointment. So that said, I do believe the Sega Master System does have the better graphics compared to these other two consoles. Alright, next let's move on to the sound chip. This generation of home video game consoles marks a change in how video games were designed with sound. Where the previous generation focused mainly on short melodies as a title theme and sound effects throughout gameplay, this generation was expected to have a musical accompaniment to play throughout the entire game. Taking a look at the Nintendo Entertainment System, you can see its multi-voice sound chip was evidence of this. The NES sound chip is capable of producing 2 square waves, 1 triangle, 1 noise, and 1 sample all at the same time. Usually, 1 square wave channel will be devoted to the melody, while another one would cut in and out based on sound effects that needed to play throughout the game. The noise channel is also quite heavily used for sound effects, and some even used the PCM sample channel. However, when no game sound effects needed to be played, all channels were sometimes devoted to just producing the song. Let's take a listen from a brief example from Super Mario Bros. 3. So this song actually uses all of the sound channels from the NES's sound chip, including that PCM channel. I will note that this channel wasn't commonly used. It was mainly reserved for sound effects and the occasional musical track. Here's one example of a game that used the PCM sample channel very prominently in its game soundtrack. Listen carefully and you can hear the orchestral hits and the bongo drums that are used in that channel. Of course, many game composers found ways to make beautiful sounding music without using this channel at all. Listen to Mega Man here. Mega Man's soundtrack is often regarded as some of the best music that was produced on the NES. That, and of course, Final Fantasy. Many of the themes written for this game have been reused in almost every core Final Fantasy game to date. The NES's sound chip is actually very limited because other sound chips at the time could have actually produced different waveforms and had more options on what the waveforms could do.
To combat this, the Famicom actually had a way built in for developers to include more sound channels via cartridge, and this was something that never made it over to the United States. For example, some Konami games used the VRC7, which actually used a modified YM2413 chip, that added 6 two-operator channels. Let's go ahead and take a listen to an example of this. And in case you're wondering, if you tried to use the Famicom adapter on the NES, it actually will not make use of these channels, as there's no way for those pins to be wired through the console. At least not without modifications. The Sega Master System sound chip was a little bit different in the fact that it could produce 4 voices at once, however 3 of those voices were devoted purely to square waves, and 1 was devoted to noise. If one wanted to create some sort of PCM sample, they would have to sacrifice all of the voices in order to create that sound. Because all channels were forced to make the same type of sound, some of the music does sound a bit more generic. That said, some game composers were able to make some very beautiful sounding music even despite this limitation. Let's listen to a clip from Sonic the Hedgehog. This song was actually ported from the Sega Genesis to the Sega Master System, and I think it was done very well. Since the Master System sound chip only produces square waves, I think that a lot of music sounds very similar between each game. It's not that they have the same melody, but it's like they use the same instrument. And I think, especially after repeated playthroughs of the same music, everything sounds very bland, and can get worn out very quickly. Nevertheless, I did find some catchy tunes that were created on this console. This is from Enduro Racer. The soundtrack from Shinobi also received critical acclaim when it was initially released. When researching several fan-made top 10 lists of Sega Master System games that had the best soundtracks, Sky High Zone from Sonic the Hedgehog 2 was frequently towards the top of everyone's list. Again, only in Japan, Sega released a sound expansion unit that used a YM2413 sound chip. This would give the Sega Mark III almost the same sounds as the Sega Genesis, a generation early. Here's an example of the Space Harrier theme done on the FM Sound Synthesis module. And here's that same theme as it plays on the original Sega Master System game. I previously stated my disappointment in the Atari 7800 sound chip using the same exact chip that they used in the Atari 2600. This was initially included for backwards compatibility, but this eventually became the only way of producing sound on this console. So that means it can only produce 2 voices at once. And not only that, but it's a bit more limited on the types of sounds you can create. So its use during gameplay was mostly limited to sound effects only. However, some games were able to kind of work around this and create music during gameplay, but it didn't really work out too well. Here's an example of game music that was created years later in a tech demo, where someone attempted to port the song from the Bad Apple tech demo to the Atari 2600. Okay, so that is actually tough to listen to. It actually kind of sounds like the instruments are out of tune, especially when you compare it to the Sega Master System tech demo. I think the main reason why it may sound that way is actually not because of how it was coded, but because of the limited number of sounds that the TIA chip was actually able to produce. So you're pretty much stuck with whatever the TIA chip will give you. Most of the time, if music was included on the Atari 2600, it was a short intro tune before the game started. And then the game would go back to just playing sound effects during gameplay. The best example I can think of music from the Atari 7800 using only the Atari 2600 chip has to be the game Dark Chambers.
During gameplay, I actually noticed that I was thinking of this theme throughout the entire time I was playing. Again, this follows the same style that was used on the 2600, where you have an intro tune and there's only sound effects during gameplay. The only saving grace for the 7800 was the fact that you could actually include Atari's 8-bit computer sound chip, the Pokey, inside of your cartridge and it would produce 4 square waves. And I know at least one of those voices could be swapped out for a noise channel. This allowed more advanced music to play throughout the game. The trade-off was it would make the game more expensive as they had to include another chip in the cartridge. There are only a couple of games that were released during the console's lifecycle that utilized this chip. So again, I had to look through the homebrew scene to try to find a melody that actually utilized every channel of the sound chip, and here's a good one that I found.
So wow, that is actually a night and day difference between what the Atari 7800 stock chip and the Pokey chip will give you in terms of audio quality.
Of the 2 licensed games that use this chip, Ball Blazer is perhaps the most famous example. Commando also made use of this chip, and is one of the few games to have a soundtrack that plays throughout the game.
I much prefer the audio produced by the Atari Pokey audio chip. Unfortunately, there were only 2 officially licensed games that came out that used this chip.
So which one of these consoles consistently sounds the best? First, let's show how you all voted on Twitter. Well, the easier decision is actually to say which console is last, and that is the Atari 7800. But when deciding between the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, it actually took me a little while, but I eventually decided that the Nintendo Entertainment System has the better sound consistently. One reason why I chose this system is the fact that you can have different sounds, including PCM samples, while synthesizing music. I also feel that the variety of tones that the chip can produce creates music that is more interesting to listen to over a period of time than on the Sega Master System. I do feel like the Sega Master System's music does sound bland and generic after a while, especially when listening between games. And although this may be more of a fault of the programmers and the coders behind the games, I didn't notice this as much on the Nintendo Entertainment System.
So even though the Nintendo Entertainment System sound chip is very primitive, I actually prefer the sounds it makes more than I do on any other console of its generation. I think the fact that it has dedicated channels that can make different sounds gives it an advantage to make the music not sound as bland when being played back continuously over and over again. I want to note that I'm actually not comparing specific songs or which one had more songs that I felt sounded better. I'm actually just comparing between consoles that I got tired of their music of when I was hearing the songs over and over again. I think that the Sega Master System's music can get very generic very quickly because it's making the same square sound. Yeah, they can change it a little bit, but they can't change it enough to make it have that richness or variety, if you will, to make it sound like that there are different tones being generated. And when you hear those sounds over and over and over again, it can get a bit annoying. To tell you the truth, if Atari had included the Pokey audio chip in the 7800, Atari would have hands down won this one. Not only could it produce the same square waves of the Master System, but that chip actually gives more options to music coders to manipulate the waveform to make different sounds. So if that had been built into the system, I think the Atari 7800 would have won in this category. Alright, now the moment of truth. We're going to take a look at what matters most about these game consoles. Let's compare the gameplay.
The Nintendo Entertainment System launched on October 18th of 1985. That's the official release date, however, evidence suggests that the system may have launched prior to that day based on various accounts of people involved with the system's launch. The system launched with 17 games. Many of the launch titles have been found to contain original Famicom games inside, made playable on the NES through a converter. Gyromite and Stack-Up are the most common cases, both of which have their title screens left untranslated, as Robot Gyro and Robot Block respectively. However, the launch title that stole the show was Super Mario Bros. This game's instant popularity with fans drove early console sales, and this game would set the standard for many platform and action games to come in the late 1980s. Also available at launch were 2 accessories for the Nintendo Entertainment System. One was Rob, or the Robotic Operating Buddy, as well as the Nintendo Zapper, which almost sold at a 1-to-1 rate with Duck Hunt. The following year, Nintendo continued to round out the NES's library with more arcade ports to their system. Donkey Kong was an obvious choice due to its popularity in American arcades. In August, Nintendo released a few more original titles for the system, but then in October it was followed up with the first third-party licensed titles for the system. While the initial third-party offerings are a bit forgettable, by the time Christmas season would roll around, Capcom and Konami would roll out some of the most popular games on the system. Sega's titles, released in 1986, were a bit fewer in number, but that was also the year the console launched in North America. Alex Kidd in Miracle World was Sega's answer to Super Mario Bros., and it was hoped that that would help drive sales of the console. Even with this library, including Space Harrier, Fantasy Zone, and the Ninja, the sales of the Master System would not meet expectations. The Atari 7800 launched a bit earlier than the Sega Master System, but ultimately had less titles by the end of that year, only releasing 5. Perhaps this was the largest factor that led to Atari having the lowest console sales by the end of 1986, only selling 100,000 compared with the Master System's 125,000 and the Nintendo Entertainment System's 1.1 million. I guess this is as good a time to talk about it as any. Every one of the Sega Master System games, when booted from the original Sega Master System, starts out with the Sega Master System logo for about 10 seconds. The Atari 7800 has a logo screen as well, but the Nintendo does not. So in terms of getting into the game the most quickly, the Nintendo Entertainment System is actually the one that wins here. However, it varies by game how long a copyright screen stays up, or if there's a lot of game logos that needs to show up, so this wasn't really something that was unique to each console, just the logo screen is all I'm referring to. Since the first goal of home video games was to mimic the arcade machines, I figured this was a good genre to start with when comparing games between consoles. When looking to compare each console's arcade offerings, I decided to look at 32 of the most popular arcade games of the 1980s, along with a few of my own favorites thrown in, and this is the list that I came up with. There are no doubt more games that were very popular than are included on this list, but I also try to stay away from any game that was exclusive to one console. Of these games, I found 26 of them on the Nintendo Entertainment System, not including any that were exclusively published for the Famicom. Only 5 of these games were included on the Sega Master System, so I decided to extend the reach a little bit. Looking at overseas releases yielded 3 more games. Since the Game Gear shares a lot of its hardware with the Sega Master System, I also included 1 game from it as well. And then I also found 2 games that were very similar, although not the same exact game, ported to the Sega Master System. I found 14 of these games for the Atari 7800, but keep in mind there are more games that can play on this console due to the Atari 2600 being backwards compatible. Those games just won't have the upgraded graphics of the Atari 7800. Let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of examples of games that appeared on all 3 systems. Let's look at Double Dragon. The Nintendo title screen looks a bit more generic than the other 2 as it lacks a dragon. The Atari 7800 has a dragon, but the Sega Master System actually has the most detail that I see on the screen. Each game starts off with the same cutscene, although seeing her get hit 3 times at once is a bit unnerving. On the NES version, there is a mission screen before you actually start out, but the Atari and Sega version just starts you right in the action. The biggest difference on the Nintendo version is the fact that they do not have 2-player cooperative mode. As a result of this, they actually changed the story to have the second player from the arcade actually be the primary villain in this game. Also, due to further technical limitations, the game can only generate 2 enemies on screen at once, and both enemies have to be the same character. Also, all weapons on screen, including any carried by the player, disappear once a group of enemies has been defeated. In terms of having the single-player mode, this game is actually entertaining. However, I would have loved to have had the 2-player mode on this game, and I feel that feature is sorely lacking for those who would have liked to have this game for the Nintendo back in the day. Shortly after this game came out on the NES, Sega also got a license to create a home version for their console. One feature available exclusively in Japan is that this game supports the optional FM sound unit that was sold separately for the Mark III. After hearing both versions from Sega Master System sound chips, I do prefer that more advanced version, as the Sega Master System stock chip provides a very generic sounding soundtrack. The Master System version overall features brighter colors and displays up to 3 enemies on screen at once, although weapons are limited to only 1 per screen. But the biggest advantage is that this game actually retains the 2-player co-op mode, including the final face-off between both players, and has level designs that were closer to the arcade game. This game also has unlimited continues until the final stage, although there is a way to actually unlock them in the final stage as well. Double Dragon for the 7800 was actually published by Activision. This game runs and performs well on the Atari 7800, however I did notice that even though there are a lot of characters on the screen at once, the characters actually lack a lot of detail when compared to the Sega Master System and even the NES version. Graphically, I do consider this port actually very impressive for the 7800, considering that this hardware was designed primarily to run games similar to Pac-Man. Again, the sound is very lacking in this game as it's using the TIA chip for the 2600. Also, I did kind of notice a little bit of an input lag from when I was inputting things on my controller to when it actually happened on the screen. I noticed this with both the Pro controller and my custom controller. And speaking of which, I found this game almost unbearable to play using the joystick, so I definitely recommend using a different controller to play this game. Overall, which game do I think is better? First, even though I feel that the 7800 version is very impressive for the hardware, I actually rank this one as my least favorite of the bunch. The Nintendo version is the version I grew up playing, but the Sega Master System includes the 2-player option. So for that reason, I will give this one to the Sega Master System. And if I had to give a preference, I would say the Mark III version with the advanced soundtrack is the one I prefer the most. Next we'll look at an earlier arcade game. This is Ms. Pac-Man. The NES has a static title screen, while the Master System and Atari mimic the arcade version. The Nintendo version holds up very well when compared to the arcade version. In fact, to compensate for the vertical orientation of the arcade monitor, instead of stretching the graphics to fill the screen, it is now offset so you can see your score, lives, and power-ups. The graphics and sound are both faithful enough to the arcade version. Then there is the Master System version. While I applaud the fact that they include a lot more detail on Ms. Pac-Man, the ghosts, however, don't look as appealing as the original arcade version, as it looks like they attempted to improve the character models, but they end up looking a bit more distorted, in my opinion. My biggest complaint about this version is the fact that it doesn't show the entire playfield on the same screen. I'm sure this alteration was an attempt not to make the graphics appear stretched or warped, again as we were dealing with a vertical screen in the arcades. But this change actually alters the gameplay a little bit, as in the arcades you can see where the ghosts are at all times, so that affects your strategy and how you're going to beat each stage. Looking at the Atari 7800 version, I again find the opening music a bit intolerable to listen to, but on a positive note, the sound effects are a bit more enjoyable. Each character model looks exactly like they do in the arcades, and the opening background actually has the right color, as the other versions start out with a green color, but the Atari 7800 version starts out with the pink version that the arcade had. Before I tell you which one of these versions I feel is better, it should be noted that all three of these versions were created by Atari. That's right, the Sega Master System and the Nintendo version were both ports by Tengen, which was the company that Atari Games hid all of their ports under, and even made unlicensed game cartridges by bypassing the NES's lockout chip. Tengen, however, did not make any games for the Atari 7800, as they were the other half of the company that was created when Atari was split. So in part, this is why I feel the Atari 7800 version is better. My main reason, though, is that I feel the 7800 does the best job of recreating the arcade experience in the home. Next, we'll take a look at another arcade game. This is Rampage. Starting off with the NES version, you can see that the game is faithfully recreated, although this game does have to make use of a lot of sprite flickering in some spots, but overall it's not too bad. The only downside I can see to this version when compared to the other two is that they actually exclude one of the monsters, so your choice is now only 2 characters, when the other ones have 3. Moving on to the Sega Master System, you can immediately see a lot more detail on the screen. The monster has a lot more detail, as well as the buildings. Instead of having one solid color dedicated to each building as in the NES version, each building now has multiple colors, allowing it to have details that stand out from the background. The controls are tight and responsive, overall leading to an enjoyable experience. I will note that this is actually the Sega Mark III version, which includes the expanded sound module. Moving on to the 7800 version, although I don't see any sprite flickering due to the number of sprites that can be shown per line, I do notice that this game looks a little bit more bland and generic than on the other consoles. The monster does have more detail than on the NES, but the background actually has less detail over the playfield. My biggest complaint about this version was actually the controls. However, this was remedied by me playing with the custom controller that I ordered rather than the Atari 7800 joystick. Overall, while I did find each of these versions enjoyable to play, I actually preferred the Sega Master System over the other two. It controls just like the NES version, only with better graphics. The sound of the Sega Master System stock audio chip, I believe, is also better than on the NES or Atari, and the FM sound synthesis unit makes it that much better. So if you're looking for arcade titles, which console is the best for you to collect? To be quite honest, I had a good time playing arcade titles on each one of these systems and didn't really find one that was lacking in titles or didn't have very many quality converted arcade titles in their system. So it appears all three systems are tied for their arcade ports. Although I think most arcade enthusiasts of the 1980s will find something on each console they will enjoy, I will note that it does largely depend on what your favorite arcade game was, because if you enjoyed the Sega titles, they're mostly on the Sega Master System. If you enjoyed Nintendo's games, they're mostly split between the Atari and Nintendo. If you enjoyed games of the early 1980s, you're going to find more of those on Atari, but if you enjoyed games of the later 1980s, you're going to find those more on the Nintendo and Sega. Looking at action-adventure games, or platform games as they would eventually be called, Nintendo almost perfected the genre, with the original Super Mario Bros., followed by its two sequels. Sega responded in kind by creating their own platforming mascot, Alex Kidd, along with several other very good platforming games. Platform games were a rarity on the Atari 7800, though the grandfather of all platforming games can be played on this system through backwards compatibility. The only other platforming game I decided to include on here was Bentley Bear's Crystal Quest, which is a homebrew title, but from what I can see looks very promising. Before we start delving into the gameplay, I should note that this seems to be where the Nintendo Entertainment System shines the most in its game library. Just take a look at all of these titles that Nintendo had pushed out. A lot of them are first-party titles. Then the third-party developers, including Capcom and Konami, just kept pushing out those high-quality, almost perfect platforming titles. But how well do these games compare? Since most of these titles were exclusive to each system, I will not be directly comparing these games to each other to see which one was better. I will just demonstrate some of the titles from each system, and then make an overall judgment. there's one platform game that we can compare between the Nintendo and the Atari 7800, and that is, well, it looks like two different games, but the original game is actually called Nebulous. This game was ported as Castilian to the Famicom and as Tower Toppler to the 7800. These games are pretty close in terms of gameplay, and the graphics are actually pretty close as well. When looking at the version on the 7800, the bricks actually don't look like they are a solid color, but due to dithering that was used on CRT televisions, it actually appears more as a solid color than it does here in my footage. Even the sound effects between the two titles are very similar. However, if I had to choose a winner for this category, I would say it's the Atari 7800 because this one actually was released on this console in North America. I had to import Castilian for the Famicom and get an adapter for it to work on my Nintendo. Ghosts and Goblins was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and its sequel, Ghouls and Ghosts, was released on the Sega Master System. The difference in graphics between the NES and the Sega Master System is very apparent in these two versions. The Sega Master System has a lot more detail and color on the screen than on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Because I grew up playing Ghosts and Goblins on the NES, I'm a little bit partial to its soundtrack, however I do believe it was better done on the Sega Master System. Overall, I think Ghouls and Ghosts is the better title out of these two, however it may not be fair to compare a sequel on one console to its earlier version on another. However, Ghouls and Ghosts did not make an appearance on the Nintendo Entertainment System, rather it would get a port on the Super Nintendo. When looking at action platform games on each of these systems, I have to say I found a number of titles that I instantly fell in love with. Nintendo had the largest number of titles, but even though the Master System doesn't have as many, they still have a lot of very good platform games that I actually find myself preferring to play nowadays because I didn't grow up with those titles and I'm looking forward to the challenge. The Atari 7800's library is actually lacking a lot here, so I put that in last place. However, overall I believe it's a tie between the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System. Moving on to role-playing games, we can see that there are several iconic franchises that got their start on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Master System also presents a respectable line of RPGs, while the Atari 7800 still shows up to this battle with one. Some of the more astute among you may feel that Dark Chambers is more of a platforming game, but its official designation is role-playing platform game. The same can be said about Star Tropics, which I did include in the role-playing category of the Nintendo Entertainment System review, mainly because it is an action-adventure game with role-playing elements integrated in. I would say the first role-playing game many of us in the US played was probably The Legend of Zelda. This game frequently appears at number 1 on many best games of all time lists. What can I say about Final Fantasy that hasn't been said a million times before? This is an iconic franchise that almost invented the genre as we know it to this day. My only criticism of this game is the fact that this is the first, and there were some flaws with this game that a lot of people don't really cover. However, future entries in this franchise have reached almost perfection. Now, I don't think this is a bad game at all. In fact, I do really enjoy this game. I just think the later games greatly improved upon this first one. Ultima was one of those RPGs that was commonly found on computers of the 8-bit era. When this game was ported to the NES, the graphics and sound were completely redone, and the amount of dialogue was reduced, presumably because of limited cartridge space. However, if you did not own a computer at this time, this was a great way for people to be able to be introduced to this series. Destiny of an Emperor is kind of a hidden gem on the NES. Being developed by Capcom, something that is unique about this game is that it's actually based on Chinese history. Perhaps the most popular and definitely the most recognized of the role-playing games on the Sega Master System has to be Phantasy Star. This game is also recognized as having one of the first female lead characters, alongside Samus of Metroid. Ys is another role-playing game that got its start on home computers before being ported to the Sega Master System. There are some differences between the computer and the home console version, but overall it plays about the same. As far as I can tell, this was the first time that this series made its way over to North America. Golden Axe Warrior is kind of an action-adventure game, but also has role-playing elements, drawing comparisons to NES titles such as Legend of Zelda and Willow. Dark Chambers, although playing more like an action game, does have some role-playing elements built in. That gives this game the distinction of being the only game on this console that has role-playing elements built into it. This game is mostly comprised of dungeon crawling stages, and happens to be one of my favorite on the Atari 7800. So when looking at role-playing games that appeared on all of the consoles of the 8-bit era, first off, I should mention that since I am not a native of role-playing games, as I didn't get into them until years later, that this opinion is going to be just based on my limited experience with them. I was able to find a number of quality titles on both the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System. The 7800 only had one game with role-playing elements, however there were a few role-playing games of the 2600 era, so I included that in the overall quality. However, those games are very primitive. My final judgment on role-playing games is that you will have a good experience on either the Nintendo or the Sega. It wasn't until 1987 when Nintendo started making a huge pull away from the other competition, and a large contributing factor to that is the fact that Nintendo had a much larger third-party lineup. Here you can see all of the titles that were released in the first half of 1987. Third-party games from Capcom, Konami, SNK, and Bandai helped to drive sales of the console, including a new accessory, the Power Pad. But in that August, another double whammy would hit the market that would push Nintendo into near legendary status. Both Metroid and The Legend of Zelda were released in August of 1987. These games launched two of Nintendo's most successful franchises that are still active to this day. And for the holiday season of 1987, titles such as Mega Man, Punch-Out!, and the much-anticipated Top Gun game made Nintendo the clear and only choice for gamers in 1987. Sega was also pushing out many hits, but again they were developing most of these games on their own. And by this point it was becoming clear that Tonka, the distributor of the Master System in the United States, was not doing a very good job at presenting this console as an alternative to the rising Nintendo Entertainment System. In 1987, even sales of the Atari 7800 started overtaking the Master System. Brand recognition and price may have been driving these sales, as the game library was only expanding at a rate of about only one game a month. When looking at puzzle games, there are actually several first-party titles that Nintendo put out, including their own version of Tetris. While the Master System did not have an official version of Tetris here in the United States, it had a very well-done clone from Sega called Columns. And it looks like we'll be able to do some more direct comparisons between these consoles because some of these games were ported between each system. The only game that made it to all three systems was Klax, although the Atari 7800 version is a homebrew port. However, in its officially released library, it does have a few exclusive games that did not make it to North America on the Nintendo or Sega consoles. Let's first do a comparison of Klax, which is the only game that got a port to all three systems. This game was originally released in 1990 and was designed by Dave Ackers and Mark Steven Pierce. The object of this game is to line up colored blocks into rows of similar colors to make them disappear. This game features a conveyor belt at the top of the screen, and it constantly rolls towards the play area, delivering a steady supply of blocks. The player controls a small device which sits at an interface between the conveyor belt and the playing area. It can be moved left and right to catch the blocks and deposit them in either the playing area, which can hold up to 25 blocks in a 5x5 arrangement, or push them back up the conveyor belt. The device itself can hold up to 5 blocks. An uncaught block is considered a drop. 3 drops and you're out. I'm also noting that the Atari 7800 version is a homebrew port. All of these games perform just about the same and have about the same graphics and style. The Master System is the only version to have a soundtrack playing throughout the game, as the other two versions only have the ominous sound of blocks falling towards the screen. Overall, if you're a fan of this game, I don't think you can go wrong with any of these ports. Let's take a look at some of the other puzzle games that appeared on these systems. Now, there were a few popular puzzle games that made it to both the Sega Master System and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and I'd argue that one of the most popular had to be Lemmings. This game was first released on the Commodore Amiga. However, it would eventually make its way to almost every 8-bit computer and home console up until the mid-1990s. Its popularity during this time frame almost can't be overstated. However, looking at the Sega Master System versus the Nintendo version, you can tell the Master System definitely has a leg up in terms of graphics. However, for the most part, both games do a good job at faithfully recreating the experience from the computer version. The biggest difference being the fact that neither console has a mouse that you can use, so you have to use the control pad to move the cursor around the screen. In my opinion, overall, I believe the Sega Master System is just a tad bit better. It provides a better graphics experience as well as a little bit better sound with similar gameplay to the NES. The soundtrack on the NES is actually something I think could have been done a little bit better, at least for this port, and the graphics are just a tad bit more bland than on the Sega Master System. So between all the puzzle games, I think that the NES and Sega Master System had a leg up over Atari. However, Atari has made a little bit of a comeback thanks to the homebrew scene creating homebrew titles of some of the puzzle games that came out. That also includes a version of Tetris for the 2600. Light guns were no stranger to home consoles, as the very first video game console, the Magnavox Odyssey, also had a light gun accessory. Although if you take a look at the Magnavox rifle, you can tell this was designed at an age where they didn't care if a toy gun looked realistic. In fact, I believe in their marketing it was touted how realistic the gun looked. Fast forwarding back to the 1980s, you can tell that none of these guns were designed to look as realistic as that. However, the Nintendo Zapper did get a redesign as it was thought to look too close to a real gun under certain circumstances. The Sega Light Phaser would eventually also get an orange painted tip. However, the Atari XE light gun did not. Perhaps it was thought that this gun never looked realistic, or it could have been a combination of that and the fact that this accessory didn't sell well for the Atari 7800, as it was designed and bundled for sale with the Atari XE game system. While I did become partial to the Sega Light Phaser, I am still very nostalgic for the Nintendo Zapper. But I also ended up liking the Atari XE light gun as well, so perhaps we'll find more of a difference in the gameplay. The Nintendo Entertainment System offers a variety of iconic titles, including Duck Hunt. The Sega Master System also has a respectable number of titles, including their own clones of Duck Hunt and Hogan's Alley. Even though the Atari 7800 does not have its own light gun, it is compatible with the Atari XE light gun, and there are a fair number of titles for this system as well. Warning: due to the nature of light gun games, the following sequence contains several screen flashes. Viewer discretion is advised. Looking at one last Twitter poll, we can see what was favored to win in this category. Overall, while the Nintendo Entertainment System has the most light gun titles, it's actually a bit more balanced out in terms of game quality with the Sega Master System and the Atari 7800, as there are some light gun titles that I didn't find very enjoyable. I did have some issues with the Sega Master System's Light Phaser when getting it to work on my console, so I actually haven't had a chance to play every single game in its library yet. After playing through the entire Atari 7800 light gun library, I actually didn't find a bad game in the bunch, and I really enjoyed them. Overall, I think if you collect light guns for any of these systems, I think you're going to be able to find a game that you enjoy. Shooting games took the arcade scene by storm in the mid-1980s, and several of them ended up making their way to home consoles, with varying degrees of success. Due to the fact that home hardware could not faithfully reproduce the arcade version of most of these games, a lot of their home ports have their own unique direction. Capcom and Konami were responsible for a majority of the most popular shooting games on the NES. Sega was able to faithfully reproduce one of their most popular shooting games from the arcade on their console, and that was Fantasy Zone. The Master System is also the only 8-bit console to get a port of R-Type. As the Atari 7800 was suited to have multiple sprites on the screen, such as multiple enemies and bullets, a lot of the popular arcade shooters also made its way to this console. As we have some games that were released for all three systems, let's go ahead and take a look at some of those first. Let's look at Commando. And you'll see here in a second that there actually was not a version released for the Sega Master System. However, I found a game that is pretty darn close, and that is Rambo. So even though two of these are the same exact game, the title screen between the Nintendo and Atari are vastly different. Once you get into the gameplay, you can see that all of the games actually run at about the same speed, with a similar amount of enemies coming at you, and bullets traveling about the same speed as well. The Nintendo Entertainment System does suffer from some slowdown every once in a while, and there is a lot of sprite flickering, especially when enemies come across the same horizontal position as the main character. This is no worse than a lot of other Nintendo games though, so I did find this very tolerable. In direct contrast, I didn't notice any of that on the Atari 7800 version. Although I must say I noticed that this game seems to run a bit slower for some reason. It's not that the console is struggling to play it, I think this was more of a design choice when the game was ported over to make everything run a bit slower. Enemy bullets are slower, the player's bullets are slower. It wasn't anything that really hurt the game, but it was just something that I noticed when compared to the Nintendo. Moving on to the Sega Master System, even though this is a different game, the similarity in the art direction and the gameplay is striking. You can tell that the playfield resolution is a lot smaller as there is a bar on the top and the bottom of the screen. However, it does seem to blend easily into the background, so it was something I did not really notice when I was playing. Bullets in this game are larger, so they were a lot easier to see, and the speed of this version is actually comparable to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Looking at all three of these games for direct comparison, I have to say that the Sega Master System probably wins me over a little bit in terms of the gameplay department. The Atari version, while fun to play, I didn't find as enjoyable due to the slower speed, but I was actually surprised to hear the game soundtrack playing through, as this is one of the cartridges that has a Poki audio chip. The graphics of this game are a bit more appealing than on the Nintendo Entertainment System due to its expanded color palette, although I did notice the screen is a little bit more scrunched down due to it having an overlay at the top of the screen showing your health and other information. Looking at all of these games, each one has their own strengths and weaknesses, however I didn't find a bad one in the bunch, so when trying to determine which game is better, I'd have to say it's quite a draw. I found all of these games enjoyable on each console. Even though Choplifter has an arcade game, it actually got a start on the Apple II. Due to its popularity, Sega created an arcade version and also ported that version to their home console, the Master System. The Atari 7800 also received a port of this game as well, although it's based on the earlier computer versions. The NES actually never received a copy of this game, so I'm actually playing the Famicom version that is being converted to play on my Nintendo. The Famicom version is a faithful enough port and actually plays fairly smoothly. I didn't actually notice much sprite flickering even though there are a lot of objects on the screen. My only nitpick about this game is that the soundtrack seems to only use one of the channels of the NES sound chip, so I didn't enjoy that as much. However, the game itself is very solid. The Atari 7800 makes easy work of this game, and it actually doesn't even bother with having a soundtrack, but the original game didn't have one either. I found this version enjoyable as well. However, the Sega Master System version is on a whole nother level. When Sega ported this game to the arcade, they actually made some changes to make it a bit more appealing to gamers. All in all, from the very detailed graphics to the advanced soundtrack this game offers, I found this game a tad more enjoyable than the other two. Overall though, I didn't actually have a bad experience on any console playing this game. Next we'll try one of the earliest shooting games I could find on these consoles, and that is Galaga. Galaga did not have a port to the Sega Master System, so I'm using the Game Gear version here. The Nintendo Entertainment System does a good job of making a near arcade-perfect port of this game. One decision that really helped out this game was the fact that they decided to make the screen still be vertically oriented instead of stretching the image out. They used the blank space to put in your high score, your 1-up, your points, and your ships. The sound effects are also near arcade-perfect as well. If you do play this game on the NES, I would actually recommend playing it with the NES Advantage controller, especially if you like playing this game more in the arcade. The Atari 7800 also does a very good job porting this game, although the graphics are a bit more stretched as they decided to make it fill the whole screen. This is one of the few games on the Atari 7800 where I actually enjoyed playing it with the original joystick rather than my custom controller. Even though this game did not come out on the Sega Master System, because the Game Gear shares a lot of the hardware of the Sega Master System, I decided to compare this version with the other two. This game has more detail on the sprites and more detail on the backgrounds. One thing you may notice is that some of the sprites may seem oversized or the playfield seems kind of small, and that is due to the decreased screen resolution of the Sega Game Gear. Overall though, a solid port, and I think it's enjoyable to play today, especially when you're playing it portably. However, when comparing this to Nintendo and Atari, they are the clear winners because they actually have the ports on their system. Before we move on to some of the most popular titles on each system, it is interesting to note that Tengen, the Atari Games brand of Atari, ported several unlicensed titles to Nintendo from Sega, and Fantasy Zone is one of those titles. Fantasy Zone is like an R-type style shooter if they allowed you to go back and forth across the screen. I believe the soundtrack is a little bit better on the Nintendo Entertainment System version. The colors of the sprites and backgrounds are done very well, however, the sprites are just a tad bit choppy in their movement, especially on some of these bigger enemies. Due to this being an unlicensed title, I actually didn't know this game existed for the Nintendo until I started doing research for this video. My first experience with this title was on the Sega Master System. The first thing I noticed about the Sega Master System version is how bright all of the colors are, and this was actually a common critique of this game when it first came out. Compared to the arcade version, I actually think the NES has a closer match on the colors, but the Sega Master System has a better match on detail. Both games are playable and fun, however, I think that most people will have a preference towards the one they played growing up, or towards which system they grew up with. Gradius was released by Konami in arcades in 1985, and the following year on the Famicom, eventually making it to the Nintendo Entertainment System that Christmas. There were several changes to this version due to the hardware limitations of the Famicom. The Moai stage, for example, lacks vertical scrolling present in the arcade game, and the maximum amount of options the player can upgrade to was reduced from 4 to 2. And yes, you can enter the Konami code while the game is paused, and it will give the ship almost all the power-ups. However, the challenge is definitely real with this one, as GameSpot has stated that Gradius is one of the toughest side-scrolling shooter games available on the NES, second only to Contra. R-Type was released in arcades in July of 1987, eventually making its way to the Sega Master System. The development team for this game drew inspiration from the game Gradius and the movie Aliens. In arcades, this game was celebrated by critics for its graphics and addictive gameplay, although it would receive criticism for its high difficulty level. It is commonly cited as one of the best shoot-'em-up games, as well as one of the greatest video games of all time. Gun.Smoke was developed by Capcom in 1985 for arcades. This game shares several similarities to games such as 1942 and Commando, both developed by Capcom, but there are some differences. The NES version stays true to the gameplay of the arcade, however there were several major changes done, again assuming they had to make up for the limitations of the Nintendo Entertainment System. On a side note, Red Dead Revolver is said to be a spiritual successor of Gun.Smoke. Astro Warrior is a shoot-'em-up game developed by Sega for the Master System in 1986. Set in space, the player flies a spaceship shooting enemies and collecting power-ups to reach the mothership of an invasion force. Reception on this game was mixed, with critics criticizing the generic nature and lack of variety, while others praised the graphics. Legendary Wings is a fantasy shoot-'em-up game released by Capcom in arcades in 1986. Again, the NES version had several differences from the arcade. While the basic premise and formula remains essentially the same, several changes were made to the gameplay, particularly in how the player's power-ups work. While Afterburner did get an unlicensed port to the NES, I believe the Sega Master System version is superior. Designer Yu Suzuki initially designed this game to work on Sega's AM2 in arcades. This game did launch a very profitable series from Sega, and is revered as one of the more popular titles on the system. Life Force, originally named Salamander, was released in arcades initially by Konami in 1986, and is a spin-off of Gradius. Thunderblade is a helicopter-based third-person shooter originally released in arcades in 1987. The game's plot and setting resembles the 1983 film and the 1984 TV series Blue Thunder. This version on the Sega Master System was positively received upon release, and is still worth picking up even to this day. Section Z is a side-scrolling shooter developed by Capcom, initially for arcades in 1985. It made its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System a couple years later in 1987. This version features 3 stages, each comprising of 20 sections, for a total of 60, which are full-fledged levels, although not all sections need to be visited in order to complete the game. Galaxy Force is a third-person shooter space combat game developed and published by Sega in 1988. The Sega Master System version is especially impressive for the hardware they were working with, as this was initially a 3D shooter. Overall, worth a pickup if you can find this game. Overall, while I found the Atari 7800 titles very impressive, I found the lack of graphical detail to be often annoying and sometimes just distracting from the gameplay, especially from games of the late 1980s. I feel that both the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System have better quality titles, and I think you will not be disappointed if you collect shooting games for either of these two systems, with the Nintendo Entertainment System having a slight edge over the Master System with its number of titles. Nintendo sales hit a new peak in 1988, again being spurred on by its strong first-party and third-party lineup. And this is despite a chip shortage from Nintendo, as Nintendo was still requiring that all licensees have their cartridges manufactured by Nintendo. In fact, that Christmas, Super Mario Bros. 2 was the hot ticket item that many people were unable to find due to the fact that they were not able to keep up with demand. Nintendo started rationing chips between each developer, keeping of course its largest stockpile for itself. This would rub a lot of third-party companies the wrong way, as they would try to find loopholes in how to manufacture their own cartridges, circumventing Nintendo. Other game developers simply started new companies so they can get more games produced in a year. The hits kept coming in 1989, with games like Tecmo Bowl, Mega Man 2, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, DuckTales, and Tetris tearing up the sales charts. Even despite two new consoles entering into the market, starting the next generation of home video game consoles, in 1990 Nintendo was still going strong with its biggest sales year yet, with titles such as Batman, Super Mario Bros. 3, Final Fantasy, an arcade port of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, another Mega Man, Dr. Mario, and other titles. 1988 was a pivotal year in the Sega Master System for the United States. Long-awaited games such as Alien Syndrome, Phantasy Star, R-Type, and Shinobi were some of their biggest hits, but they still weren't gaining as much traction as they wanted to in the North American video game market. Starting in 1989, there would be a decline of new games coming out for the Sega Master System. However, that is in large part due to the fact that Sega, trying to get the jump on Nintendo, released a brand new 16-bit console, and many of these titles would come out for this system as well. 1988 was also the biggest year for the Atari 7800. This year had the most new game releases, but if you take a look at some of the more popular titles, a lot of these games were just ports of older arcade games. 1989 would see more recent arcade ports, and 1990 would see a lot more console exclusives, but the overall number of games being released for the Atari 7800 were sharply declining. During the last year that Atari officially supported this console, there were no new titles released in North America. Racing games on 8-bit consoles were very primitive, as there wasn't really a good way of doing 3D graphics using this limited hardware. However, this did not stop developers, including Nintendo, from creating racing games on this system, and some of them are very fun. Some of Sega's biggest hits in the arcade in the 80s were racing games, so it makes sense that they would port those to their home console. I also think that one of these racing games holds the title of having the best graphics on the Sega Master System. I want to take this moment to make a correction when I said that Pole Position 2 was the only racing title released for the 7800. Motor Psycho was originally released in PAL regions. However, there were conflicting sources on whether or not this game was released in the US. It looks like it did receive a release in North America, however it is very rare to find and you're not likely to come across it. Fatal Run is also another racing game that was released for the 7800, however it also is very rare. That said, most likely you're going to be playing the pack-in game that came with the 7800, and that is Pole Position 2. Otherwise, there are several racing games that released for the 2600 that are also backwards compatible with the 7800. Now, there's no racing game that made it to all three consoles, but since each console has a similar style of racing game, I thought we'd go ahead and do a comparison of those three. We're going to take a look at Rad Racer on Nintendo, Outrun on Sega Master System, and Pole Position 2 on the Atari 7800. Rad Racer offers some of the best graphics on the Nintendo Entertainment System in terms of a 3D background. Using raster effects, they are able to give the illusion of the track coming out of the background, including elevated and lowered terrain. This game is quite fun and on par of some of the arcade racers of the late 1980s. Pole Position 2 provides a much-needed upgrade from the original Pole Position on the Atari 2600. In this game, though, the game background stays mostly level, only providing turns for challenge. Another nitpick, but this is due to the limitation of the console, is that the sound effects are almost exactly the same as the Atari 2600. So unfortunately, no music can be played, and the engine sound effects can get a little dull. Outrun on the Sega Master System is very well done, and quite possibly the best graphical presentation of these three games. My only criticism of this game is that instead of having any engine sound effects at all, it is instead replaced with a soundtrack. However, you can choose what tune plays before you start racing. Overall, I do have a hard time picking a favorite out of the bunch, as each one has its own strengths and weaknesses. But if I had to pick a favorite, I would probably choose the Sega Master System, followed closely by the Nintendo Entertainment System. However, my overall favorite racing game on the Nintendo Entertainment System is actually a side-scrolling racing game called Excite Bike. One downside of this game, though, is that you can only play one player at a time. Bill Elliott's NASCAR Challenge is the first NASCAR licensed game to be released on a home console, and I think this game does the best job of producing a 3D track. RC Pro-Am was developed by Rare, the same company that would be responsible years later for Donkey Kong Country. The game itself is presented in an overhead isometric perspective. A single player races radio-controlled cars around a series of tracks. This game frequently makes an appearance in the top games of all time lists that I've seen, and is regarded as one of the best titles in the NES's library. Hang On the Sega Master System is a very good game as well, however it is very similar to Outrun except for you're on bikes this time. Enduro Racer on the Sega Master System reminds me a lot of Excite Bike, only turned to have a different perspective, scrolling up the screen rather than scrolling side to side. As for which racing game I feel has the best graphics, I turn to the Sega Master System version of Road Rash. Unfortunately, this was released well after the Master System had lost any relevance it had in the North American video game market, so that's probably why it was only released in Europe. We would get a version of this game on the Game Gear, and that version is impressive as well. Overall, although the Nintendo has the most titles out of any of the systems, I feel that the Sega Master System produces overall better quality racing titles than on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Atari has some great racing titles for it as well, however you're going to be hard pressed to find these titles as there's not as many out there, and the copies that were out there didn't sell well. Sports games were the first popular video games to be produced, starting with Pong in the early 1970s, and the Nintendo Entertainment System has no shortage of sports titles. The Sega Master System also has a variety of sports titles, but most of these were produced by Sega. Even the Atari 7800 has a sports game for almost every popular sport of the era. Perhaps the most popular sports title from the Nintendo, even still to this day, is Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Moving on to the Sega Master System, a movie licensed title for Rocky would be their boxing game. However, this game is often cited as definitely not being as fun or enjoyable as other boxing games of the time period. For hockey, one of my favorite games is Blades of Steel. This game strives to create an experience that includes almost everything out of a hockey game, from the fights to the Zamboni rides. The NES also has a plethora of baseball titles, although I think some of the most popular were the unlicensed RBI baseball titles. Part of Sega's marketing strategy with their self-developed sports games was apparently to add great in front of every sports game, and eventually people would think, oh, that must be a great game. Reviewers of the time gave Great Baseball kind of an average passing score, but modern reviews are not as kind. A now classic and iconic title, Tecmo Super Bowl was possibly the most popular football game produced during this time period, in an era before John Madden football. The Nintendo Entertainment System had tennis as one of its launch titles, and this game was heavily advertised at the time of its release. So I mean, overall it plays okay, and I definitely appreciate Mario being the referee. But this also reminds me of Sega's tennis game, and that is Super Tennis. For some reason it wasn't renamed Great Tennis here in the US. But it looks and plays almost identical to the Nintendo version, even including what looks like a generic Alex Kidd, complete with sideburns and possibly oversized ears, as the referee. Again, Nintendo launched with a soccer title, and this game is okay as well. The gameplay is solid, but the graphics and sound are a bit to be desired. Great Soccer for the Master System here in the US was actually World Soccer in the rest of the world, and it is arguably the better title between this one and the original NES version. Ball Blazer is an interesting case because it is a futuristic sports game that was created by Lucasfilm Games. Originally for the Atari 8-bit family and then ported to, you guessed it, the Atari 7800 and the Nintendo Famicom. While both versions of the game are playable, I think the 7800 version is much better. The Famicom version does not have as good of sound or graphics as the 7800 version, and I found myself enjoying that game better as a result. As this game is one of the two cartridges that has the Atari Pokey audio chip in it, the soundtrack is very well done. When it comes to golf games of this era, I actually feel there are a couple of good titles. First would be Great Golf for the Sega Master System. I feel this game probably has the best graphics of any golf game, although there is a slight loading time as it has to draw out the screen to get all the detail to show up. My other favorite golf game is Ninja Golf for the Atari 7800. Although, who wouldn't like a game where you have to golf and then fight ninjas to get to your ball, and fight a dragon so you can putt on the green? When it comes to sports games, I feel like these are the games that become dated the most quickly on classic consoles. With that said, I'm purely looking at games that are still kind of fun and enjoyable to play today, and most of the time I find myself looking at the Nintendo. Results may vary based on which console you grew up with, but I feel in North America, I think most people would prefer the Nintendo sports titles to this day, as they're going to get a bit more nostalgia out of them than on any other console. Accessories on these consoles are a tricky subject, as there are many first- and third-party offerings out there. Due to the large amount of accessories offered on some of these consoles, I decided to highlight just a few of them. Starting with the Nintendo Entertainment System, this is the Acclaim Wireless Remote Controller. Basically, this controller works on the same principle as any other remote control, in the fact that it uses IR infrared signals sent from the controller to a receiver on the other end. The receiver is plugged into the Nintendo Entertainment System via hardwire. This allowed players to be up to 30 feet away from their Nintendo Entertainment System as long as they had a clear line of sight between the receiver and the controller. Nintendo did not offer a first-party wireless controller other than the NES Satellite. This accessory essentially made up to 4 controllers wireless by plugging them into a hub that would communicate with a receiver hardwired into the console, similar to how the Acclaim remote controller works. The NES Advantage was released by Nintendo in 1987. This accessory is meant to help duplicate the arcade experience in the home by offering an arcade-style joystick. This controller has more advanced turbo features, but was not really something that players can hold in their hand. For that, players can use the NES Max, which replaced the directional pad with a joystick you can control with your thumb. This helped compact it down to something you can hold in your hands. Some of you may be aware of the Game Genie. This device allowed you to change some of the functions of the NES by interrupting communications between the cartridge and the console. This would allow players to cheat by earning unlimited lives, having more damage, or being able to jump higher than you can normally. Another accessory that was almost released at the end of the NES's lifecycle was the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. I only mention this accessory because recently it has come up a lot on eBay as people have found several unsold copies of this accessory years after its manufacturing company went bankrupt. Anyone who owned an original NES back in the 80s probably owned a cleaning kit with it as well. I actually owned an off-brand version of this, which was called the Eliminator. These were considered essential to keep your console functioning, and there's still a version of this product being sold to this day. The Konami Laser Scope is kind of a unique accessory, which during certain games would allow you to use your voice to activate buttons on your controller. For example, in one game you can say fire and the game would shoot for you, but that can get annoying as you have to say it every time to shoot. The Miracle Piano is a third-party accessory which allows you to connect, well, a piano to your Nintendo Entertainment System. This accessory was compatible with only one game, but that game was designed to help teach kids how to play the piano. And outside of that, there's not really much this accessory should be used for. And then there's the Power Glove. This accessory gained a lot of notoriety for being featured in the movie The Wizard. However, as many kids who own this accessory found out, it wasn't really as functional or practical as a gaming controller. The Power Pad is also a notable accessory. Again, only being compatible with a few games, but most of those games were running in jumping games. This was early evidence of Nintendo trying out more active style controllers. Last, we'll talk about Rob the Robot. Rob is arguably the first NES accessory ever released, I guess along with the Nintendo Zapper. However, Rob's sole purpose was to help differentiate the Nintendo Entertainment System from the gaming consoles of the past. Nintendo wanted to distract the consumer by thinking they were buying a toy or another electronic device because video games in North America were not a popular idea. But when the Nintendo Entertainment System started taking off in sales, Rob the Robot was left in the dust, leading to Rob's discontinuation early into the console's lifecycle. One accessory to set the Sega Master System apart from the Nintendo Entertainment System was the 3D glasses. This accessory does an admirable job of turning the 8-bit games of the Sega Master System into more of a 3D interactive experience. However, this concept is hard to visually explain as you have to see it for yourself to see how good it is. The control stick was another popular accessory, helping those that wanted a more arcade-like experience by providing gamers with an arcade joystick and control buttons. This was also released with a trackball controller. However, that accessory is a lot harder to come by here in North America. The Master System also got a third-party wireless controller, called the Quick Shot. However, this company also produced wireless controllers for the NES as well. The Atari 7800 had no officially released accessories for it here in North America. Even the light gun that is compatible with it was designed for another console. However, the closest thing to an accessory that I can see is an alternative controller design that was released in Europe that made the gamepad more similar to an NES controller. Overall, because accessories are seen as optional extras for your console, I will not be making a judgment on which one had better accessories. These are noted here mainly for reference.
Alright, we have console design, controllers, graphics, sound, and games. Each of these consoles provides a style unique to their own system. This gives them an aura of charm, if you will, that is almost uncomparable between each of these systems. But if we look strictly at a sales standpoint here in North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System has a clear lead. However, when you look at sales outside of North America, especially in regions where the Nintendo Entertainment System really didn't have any presence, the Sega Master System actually shines really well, especially in places like Europe and even Brazil, where the Sega Master System was released with almost no competition from Nintendo for several years. And even still to this day, you can buy a Sega Master System in Brazil, making it the longest-lived console ever produced. Nintendo also has a clear advantage in terms of its game library, having a very strong line of first-party and third-party titles. The Sega Master System's game library, especially when you add in the overseas exclusive titles, gives it a respectable second in terms of number of games, and again the Atari comes in last, having only about 60 games officially released for it. However, its library can be greatly expanded with the 2600 backwards compatibility. Looking from just these aspects alone, it would actually seem that Nintendo is the clear winner. However, yes, I believe the Sega Master System is the winner of the 8-bit war. So that's right, the Sega Master System, I believe, is the winner of the 8-bit war. Okay, let me explain. First, a lot of people may believe that because the Nintendo Entertainment System has such a vast library, it should automatically be superior to the Sega Master System. But I gotta tell you, even though Nintendo had strict quality control standards on the games that were put out onto its console, there are still some really bad games on there. I mean, games that just have graphical glitches, aren't fun to play, or just generally bad. In fact, there are other people who have made their careers on how bad the NES library can be at times. But when comparing game genres, I noticed that the Master System had a game to compete with all of Nintendo's best. For example, Alex Kidd in Miracle World could compete with the Mario series. Comparing RPGs, Sega's Phantasy Star, I think, clearly wins over games like Final Fantasy. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that the first Final Fantasy is bad in any way, I just think that Phantasy Star is the better game. Final Fantasy would eventually probably overtake that series, especially in their later games, but the first Final Fantasy is a bit basic and not very involved. Some of the better racing games on Nintendo, such as Rad Racer, is a blatant ripoff of Sega's arcade games that they had, Outrun and Hang On. And not only do I think they look a little bit better on the Sega Master System, I think they perform better. Now again, that's when comparing apples to apples. I didn't find a game that was like Excite Bike, and that game is good for other reasons, but I think that if Sega had a game like that, I think it would have been better on the Sega Master System. And speaking of the games that Sega was able to bring to the market, Sega had to develop a lot of the games themselves. Sega did have some third-party developers, but not as many as Nintendo, and there's a reason behind that. So when Nintendo entered the North American video game market, they wanted to make sure that there was not really a bad game produced for their system because they were afraid of becoming the next Atari. As a result of this, and clearly to their advantage, they decided to put in their licensing agreements to people who wanted to make games for their system. They put it in there that if you made a game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, you could make that same game for another console. All of this would be settled later in an antitrust lawsuit against Nintendo, but for the 1980s, all of this was in full practice. And despite that, Sega still competes successfully with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Looking at places like Europe, where Nintendo really didn't have a presence for the beginning of the 8-bit war, and places like Brazil, where Nintendo really didn't have a presence at all throughout the life cycle of that system, they sold extremely well. And this is evidence to me that if Sega was able to compete fairly with the Nintendo Entertainment System, it would have been a much closer fight. However, Sega did make a few mistakes of their own. First, their distributor of the console here in North America didn't do a very good job of marketing the system. I mean, one major criticism of the Sega Master System is how bland all of their products look. I mean, if you look at this game, it might be interesting, it might not, but to a kid walking down the aisles, if they see this next to something like this, which one are you going to pick as a kid? You're probably going to pick this because of the multiple colors, the beautiful artwork, and here we have clip art, kind of badly photoshopped on a square background. Alright, so maybe I'm over-exaggerating a little on the box art, but that's just one example of how the Master System wasn't marketed as well as the Nintendo Entertainment System. Lastly, let's look at the Master System compared to the Atari. Even though a lot of people were skeptical of the Atari brand, especially after the video game crash, if it's one thing we like in America, it seems to be a comeback story. And Atari was fixing to make a comeback. And so us rooting for the underdog, I think, kind of drove sales of the Atari. Plus, they had the advantage of backwards compatibility. So if you kept all of your 2600 games, you instantly had a game library that could be played on your TV, despite maybe even getting rid of the old console. Atari's marketing was a bit more aggressive on their price point, making it a cheaper system. All games $20 or under, what parent wouldn't like buying that for their kids? And the games, it's not like the kids would have been extremely disappointed if they got an Atari 7800, I know I wouldn't have, because the Atari 7800 games provide that much needed graphics upgrade for the Atari to keep it relevant. Last thing I want you guys to keep in mind is that I grew up on Nintendo. I didn't know that the Sega Master System even existed until the year 2000. I read about this system in a book and I was like, whoa, Sega had a system beforehand? Again, that points towards Sega's bad marketing of the system, because as a child, I never knew about it. From the first game that I put in, I noticed that the games looked better, but after a while, I noticed I found these games fun. It helped me revisit my childhood in a way that wasn't just repeating the past, I was expanding upon it. And for the last 3 years, this console has provided me with a lot of entertainment. And that's with me having almost full access to the Nintendo Entertainment System's library. So in the end, that's the perspective from today. However, the immediate winner of the 8-bit war was the Nintendo Entertainment System. I mean, it just dominated the North American video game markets. But anyway, that's just my opinion, and I've stated my reasons why. But what do you guys think? Leave a comment below and let me know, did you agree with my opinions in this show or not? Defend your console from your childhood, or which one you feel is better, down in the comments below. I'd really like to see your guys' take on it.
Well, Sega won the battles, but Nintendo won the war. Though along with Sega, Atari would continue to challenge Nintendo into the 90s. But for now, we will say goodbye to a generation of consoles that brought the video game industry back from the dead and launched it into its very prosperous future. This is the generation that defined what home consoles would be for the next 30 years. The next generation of home video game consoles would see fiercer competition as companies like SNK and NEC would join Sega in the seemingly impossible task to challenge Nintendo's dominance of the North American video game market. Sega, learning from its mistakes with the Sega Master System, would unleash a secret weapon before the decade was out, as well as a marketing campaign the likes of which has not been seen again to date. But that's a story for another time.